There are lots of potential solutions to fixing our media environment, and here are just a few of them. The first one we're going to talk about is what I call diverse funding sources. This means that there should be different media corporations with different sources of funding for running their operations. There should be at least one taxpayer-funded media corporation operating in every market. This does not mean that the government of the day can influence the content of this media corporation. It will still be independent from government control, and we must protect the funding mechanism to ensure that these kinds of taxpayer-funded media corporations are not able to be controlled by the government of the day, because that would be very problematic. The funding mechanisms and the charters for these media corporations must be established in our constitutions to protect them from government interference and control. For example, we could say that the Constitution allocates these media corporations a fixed percent or portion of tax revenue. We could establish their decision-making bodies as being independent from government officials, and we could mandate that they serve the public interest as part of their constitutional requirement. Taxpayer-funded media corporations must not be able to sell advertising. This is to avoid the conflicts of interest that are associated with for-profit media corporations, and it's to protect them from needing to please advertisers. This is very important because that freedom from advertising revenue allows taxpayer-funded media to investigate any corporation because it has nothing to lose in terms of upsetting advertisers. Having independence from advertising revenue makes this kind of media corporation essential for being able to hold corporate power to account. The second kind of ownership is what we commonly know, which is privately owned. And this means it can be owned by shareholders, individuals, groups, cooperatives, communities, special interest groups. So it's privately owned, which means the government doesn't pay any money to provide for it. There should be at least one privately or cooperatively owned media corporation in every market as well. These can be worker-owned, they can be owned by individuals or shareholders, they can be owned by a family or a community. They can be publicly traded or not, and they can be profit-seeking enterprises or they could be non-profit. What matters is that they do not receive any money from taxpayers. And this is important because it makes them completely independent from the government and from taxpayers. But because they do not receive any money from taxpayers, this kind of privately owned media corporation is likely to be reliant on advertising revenue to survive as an organization. And this limits the kinds of content that this media corporation type will be able to carry, because they will not want to upset advertisers, and they will need to keep at least some of the advertisers pleased with them to continue advertising. But this kind of ownership structure also provides an opportunity for special interests or specific communities to have their voices heard. So a community can pool their resources together and fund a media corporation that voices their stories, tells their perspective. And this might be especially true if that group is a minority within society. So they're a very small percentage of the population, but they might want to get together and have a media company to cater to their cultural interests or to look out for their interest in society and to tell their stories to the rest of society. Privately controlled media corporations serve a valuable role in society because they are more likely to hold a government accountable than taxpayer-funded media. The third type of ownership is one that we might call subscription-based media corporations. And we should also have one of these in every market, or at least we should try to have one of these in every market. They are a little bit more difficult to operate because you have to convince people to pay for a subscription to your media channel. And this has been quite difficult for a lot of media companies. These kinds of subscription-based companies can be private, worker-owned, or non-profit enterprises. What matters is that they do not rely on advertising revenue, and they are also more independent from government than taxpayer-funded media might be. The greater independence of a subscription-based funding model enables these kinds of media corporations to hold both government and industry accountable and able to investigate both. However, since it can be difficult to get people to pay for a subscription when free alternatives might exist, even though they have advertising, it's probably wise that there can be an option for these kinds of corporations, especially if they're non-profit, or maybe even only if they're non-profit, to get tax rebates and tax breaks. These kinds of special tax rates might allow these subscription-based non-profit media corporations to reduce their cost of operation and operate on a subscription model But the exception would have to be probably that they definitely need to be non-profit media corporations. So you wouldn't have a for-profit subscription-based media channel that got tax breaks, because that would be, well, that would not be good. The next part of the solution is to have media corporations that are separate from all other kinds of companies. In other words, media corporations must be independent from ownership by any other kind of business. A media company must only be a media company. They cannot be a part of a family or group of companies that also includes companies operating in different industries. Full or partial ownership of media corporations makes them vulnerable to outside influence, and this compromises their integrity. A media corporation must be completely independent from any other kind of business or industry. They must be able to be objective when investigating stories, or when they are providing news about products and services provided by government or industry. If we can remove the possibility of this kind of cross-ownership or external ownership of media corporations by other kinds of corporations or by interests in other industries, we will create a more independent media. This will enable the media to perform its essential function of keeping us informed. Media independence from external ownership matters for all kinds of media. So this includes things like editorials and discussion shows where we might get people's opinions. It also matters for more factual things like documentaries or investigative reports journalism. It matters for all kinds of programming and content. For example, it's probably very important that we prevent external cross-ownership of academic and scientific publications to avoid conflicts of interest affecting the integrity of knowledge and scientific discoveries. Even entertainment shows and content can include messages that shape people's viewpoints, beliefs, and even voting choice. So media corporations must not have any kind of other external ownership by other industries or companies in other industries to protect public decision-making and public debate from manipulation by private interests or special interests from other industries. This separation between media and other kinds of corporations must be complete and absolutely without exception, because those exceptions will become loopholes. For example, if we allow community associations to own newspapers, this could lead to a situation where private corporations set up and finance community associations to enable them to control newspapers. Another example might be if we allow educational institutions to own radio stations, then private interests might establish educational institutions to enable them to control radio stations. A genuinely independent media corporation must also be independent from other types of organizations beyond for-profit corporations. For example, media corporations should not be controlled by religious institutions. They definitely shouldn't be controlled by political parties. They also should not be controlled by trade unions or even non-profit organizations, because these groups all have ideologically motivated reasons to broadcast a certain perspective. We must also be very careful about allowing other kinds of groups to own media corporations. So if we have religious institutions or even political parties owning media channels, this creates a conflict of interest and goes back to what we were talking about earlier with regards to ideologically motivated ownership. Even things like non-profit organizations and trade unions are ideologically motivated groups, and there is an incentive for these groups to use their media channels to spread what is effectively propaganda. Even if you might agree with what they're spreading, by allowing a group that's doing something you agree with to do it, you allow groups that you don't agree with to do the same thing. We might have to block all groups simply to prevent groups that we don't agree with from doing the thing that we might want to do. This is the nature of making laws. Laws have to apply to everyone equally. So we must be quite strong on this rule that there must be no exceptions to media companies being separate from all other types of organizations and not being owned or controlled by any other kinds of organizations, because this opens a path to conflicts of interest.